Good evening, everyone. I want to begin with a strange question. Raise your hand if you believe you chose to come here today. Now keep it up if you think that decision was completely yours. Interesting. Because what if I told you that your brain may have started making that decision before you even knew about it? Think about that, the voice in your head that says, I decided. What if it's not the captain of the ship, but just the narrator explaining where the ship has already gone? That's uncomfortable, isn't it? We grow up believing we're the authors of our lives. We choose our careers, we choose our friends, we choose what to eat for breakfast. But science asks a dangerous question. Did you actually choose, or did your brain choose first, and your conscious mind simply took the credit? This isn't just philosophy anymore. Neuroscience has begun peeking inside the brain while decisions are being made. And what scientists have discovered is so surprising that it forces us to rethink one of humanity's oldest beliefs. Does free will really exist? Tonight, let's follow the evidence, not our intuition, and discover whether we're truly in control, or whether control itself is one of the greatest illusions the human brain has ever created. Have you ever caught yourself saying something like, I don't know why I did that, or I wasn't even thinking? We've all had moments like these. Maybe you reached for your phone without realizing it. Maybe you walked into the kitchen and completely forgot why you went there. Or perhaps you've reacted to someone in anger and only later thought, I should have handled that differently. These everyday experiences hint at something fascinating. Not every decision begins with conscious thought. For centuries, philosophers debated whether free will exists. But in the last few decades, scientists stopped arguing only with ideas and began asking the brain directly. Thanks to modern neuroscience, they could actually watch the brain at work while people made simple decisions. One of the most famous experiments was carried out by neuroscientist Benjamin Libet in the 1980s. His experiment was surprisingly simple. Volunteers sat in front of a clock and were asked to perform a small action whenever they felt like it, such as flexing a finger or pressing a button. There was no right or wrong moment. They could do it whenever they wanted. At the same time, electrodes recorded the electrical activity in their brains. The participants also had to note the exact moment they became consciously aware of deciding to move. Most people would expect the order to be obvious. First, you consciously decide to move your finger. Then your brain sends the signal to your muscles. Finally, your finger moves. But that isn't what the experiment showed. The recordings revealed that the brain had already begun preparing for the movement hundreds of milliseconds before the participants reported becoming aware of making the decision. In other words, the brain seemed to begin the process first, while conscious awareness arrived a little later. Now, let's pause for a moment, because this is where many people misunderstand the experiment. The finding does not prove that human beings are robots, or that our choices are completely fake. What it challenges is something much more specific. The idea that our conscious mind is always the starting point of every decision. Instead, it suggests that much of what we experience as a conscious choice may actually be the final step in a much longer process that has already been unfolding beneath the surface. Think about how often your brain works without asking your permission. Your heart keeps beating while you're asleep. Your eyes automatically focus on objects. You instantly recognize the face of a friend in a crowded room without consciously calculating every detail. Your brain is constantly processing enormous amounts of information before you're even aware of it. Why should decision-making be any different? Imagine an iceberg floating in the ocean. The small part above the water is your conscious mind, the thoughts you can hear inside your head, but beneath the surface lies the much larger part. Memories, emotions, habits, instincts, learned behaviors, and countless unconscious processes. Every decision you make may begin deep below the surface, long before it reaches conscious awareness. Think about driving a car. When you first learned to drive, every action demanded your full attention. You consciously thought about the mirrors, the pedals, the steering wheel, and every gear change. But after years of experience, much of that process became automatic. Your brain handles hundreds of tiny decisions every minute without requiring conscious effort. Sometimes you arrive home and barely remember the drive because your brain managed the routine, while your conscious thoughts wandered elsewhere. The same principle applies to many of our daily choices. When someone asks you a question in conversation, your answer often appears almost instantly. You don't consciously search through billions of brain cells to construct every sentence. The words simply arrive. Only afterward do you hear yourself speaking. That raises an uncomfortable question. If thoughts simply appear in our minds, where exactly do they come from? Did you choose your next thought before thinking it? Or did it simply emerge from the incredible machinery inside your brain? Science doesn't yet have a complete answer. The human brain remains one of the greatest mysteries in the universe. But what neuroscience continues to reveal is that our conscious experience is only one small part of an incredibly complex system. Rather than seeing consciousness as the boss giving every command, it may be more accurate to think of it as the storyteller, the part of the brain that experiences, interprets, and explains decisions that involve countless unconscious processes. At first, this idea can feel unsettling. It seems to take away something deeply personal. We like believing that every choice begins with a clear, independent I. But science often asks us to question ideas that feel obvious. After all, the Earth feels perfectly still, yet it races through space at incredible speed. The sun appears to move across the sky, yet it is the Earth that turns. Our senses can be convincing, but they are not always correct. Perhaps the same is true of free will. What feels like an instant conscious decision may actually be the visible tip of a much larger process hidden beneath awareness. The brain may begin preparing long before the conscious mind catches up, and that possibility changes the conversation forever. It doesn't necessarily eliminate free will, but it forces us to ask a deeper and more interesting question. If our brain starts the decision before we become aware of it, then who, or what, is the I that believes it made the choice? Now, even if you're not completely convinced by those brain experiments, let's step away from the laboratory for a moment and look at our everyday lives. Think about the last important decision you made. Maybe you chose your university, your career, or even the clothes you wore this morning. It probably felt like a personal choice. It felt as though you weighed your options, thought about them, and finally made a decision. But let me ask you something. Where did your preferences come from? Why do you enjoy certain foods but dislike others? Why does one person love spicy food while another can't stand it? Why does one person enjoy reading books while another would rather spend hours playing football? Why do some people dream of becoming artists while others are fascinated by mathematics or engineering? Did you consciously choose those preferences? Probably not. Long before you were old enough to make decisions, your brain was already being shaped by thousands of influences. Your family influenced the way you speak, the values you hold, and even the way you think about success and failure. Your culture taught you what is considered polite, beautiful, or acceptable. Your school, your friends, your experiences, and even your failures quietly changed your personality over the years. None of those things asked for your permission. They simply became part of who you are. Even your biology plays an enormous role. Every second, chemicals are flowing through your brain. Hormones influence your mood. Your level of stress changes how patiently you respond to people. A lack of sleep affects your judgment. Hunger can make you more impatient than you normally are. In fact, psychologists have found something almost amusing. Judges, whose job is to make fair and rational decisions, tend to make harsher decisions when they are tired or hungry compared to after they have eaten and rested. Imagine that for a moment. Two people with nearly identical cases could receive different outcomes simply because one appeared before lunch and the other after lunch. If something as simple as hunger can influence a trained professional whose career depends on careful reasoning, what does that say about the rest of us? Or consider something even more ordinary. Have you ever gone to the supermarket intending to buy just one thing, only to leave with 10 items you never planned to purchase? You might think you freely chose every product, but supermarkets are carefully designed environments. The music, the lighting, the smell of fresh bread near the entrance, the placement of products on shelves, even the size of the shopping cart. All of these details have been studied because they influence human decisions. Marketing experts understand something about the human brain that most of us don't like admitting. People are easier to influence than they believe. Social media works in much the same way. Every time you scroll through your phone, complex algorithms learn what captures your attention. They notice which videos you watch longer, which headlines make you click, and what topics keep you engaged. Slowly, almost invisibly, they begin showing you more of the same. Over time, your opinions, interests, and even your emotions can be nudged in certain directions without you ever realizing it. You still feel like you're making independent choices, but are you? Or are many of those choices being gently guided by invisible systems designed to predict and influence your behavior? Even emotions shape decisions in ways we rarely notice. Suppose someone insults you. In that instant, your heart rate rises, stress hormones are released, and your brain prepares for action. You may say something you'll regret later. Then, hours afterward, when you've calmed down, you wonder, why did I react like that? The answer is simple. The version of you who was angry was operating under a completely different biological and emotional state than the calm version sitting here today. The same person, a different brain chemistry, a different decision. Mere works this way too. Every experience you've ever had leaves traces inside your brain. Maybe you trust people easily because you grew up in a loving family. Maybe someone else struggles to trust because they experienced betrayal early in life. Both individuals believe they are freely choosing how to respond to others, but those choices are deeply connected to experiences neither of them selected. Even fear changes our decisions. Imagine standing near the edge of a tall building with a strong glass floor. Logically, you know the glass is safe. Engineers have tested it countless times, but your body still hesitates. Your palms become sweaty. Your heart beats faster. Your conscious mind says, "It's safe." Your brain says, "Danger." Which one usually wins? Our brains evolved over millions of years to keep us alive, not necessarily to help us make perfectly rational decisions. That ancient survival system still lives inside each of us. It constantly scans for threats, rewards, and opportunities before our conscious thoughts even catch up. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part. We often imagine ourselves sitting inside our heads like a pilot flying an airplane, carefully controlling every movement. But modern science paints a more complicated picture. It's more like we're the captain of a ship, with an enormous crew working below deck. We don't personally control every rope, every sail, or every engine. Thousands of processes are happening beyond our awareness. By the time information reaches the captain, much of the work has already been done. That doesn't mean the captain is useless. It simply means the captain isn't working alone. So when someone says, "I made that choice entirely by myself," science gently asks another question. Which version of yourself made it? The version shaped by your genes? The version shaped by your childhood? The version influenced by your culture? The version affected by your hormones, your memories, your mood, your environment, your sleep, and even the last conversation you had? The truth is that every decision carries the fingerprints of countless invisible influences. And perhaps understanding those influences doesn't make us less human. Perhaps it makes us more honest about what it means to be human. Because the more we understand the hidden forces shaping our choices, the more capable we become of recognizing them, questioning them, and, little by little, choosing more wisely than we did yesterday. After hearing all of this, it's tempting to arrive at a dramatic conclusion. If my brain starts making decisions before I'm aware of them, if my choices are shaped by my genes, my childhood, my environment, my emotions, and even by whether I've had enough sleep, then maybe free will is nothing more than an illusion. Maybe none of us are truly responsible for anything. At first glance, that sounds logical. But here's where the story becomes far more interesting. Science doesn't simply end the conversation by saying, "You have no control." In fact, many neuroscientists and philosophers argue that this conclusion goes too far. The reality is much more subtle and much more hopeful. Think about learning to play the piano. On your first day, every finger movement feels awkward. You have to consciously think about every key you press. But after months or years of practice, your brain changes. New neural pathways form. What once required enormous effort becomes almost automatic. Now ask yourself an important question: who changed the brain? The answer isn't simple. Your brain changed because of repeated experiences, practice, attention, and learning. Every time you practiced, millions of neurons adjusted their connections. Slowly, the brain rewired itself. This remarkable ability is known as neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize itself throughout life. That means something extraordinary. The brain influences your choices, but your repeated choices also influence your brain. The relationship works in both directions. Imagine someone with a short temper. They explode over small problems, lose friendships, damage relationships, and later regret their actions. For years, this pattern repeats itself. Then one day they decide they want to change. They begin practicing patience, they read books, they attend therapy, they learn breathing techniques. At first, nothing seems different. Anger still appears almost automatically. But they keep practicing. Weeks become months, months become years. Eventually, situations that once triggered instant rage no longer produce the same reaction. Did they completely rewrite their biology overnight? Of course not. But through repeated effort, they gradually changed how their brain responded. That is one of the most beautiful discoveries in neuroscience. Your past shapes you, it does not imprison you. The same principle applies to fear. Imagine someone terrified of public speaking. Their heart races whenever they stand before an audience. Their hands shake. Their voice trembles. Many people would simply conclude, "That's just who I am." But psychologists know something different. Through gradual exposure, practice, and experience, the brain learns that speaking isn't actually dangerous. Over time, the fear becomes smaller. The person standing confidently on stage, years later, may hardly resemble the frightened beginner they once were. The circumstances changed, the brain changed. And because the brain changed, future decisions changed as well. This is why responsibility still matters. Not because every decision appears from nowhere, completely independent of every influence, but because human beings possess an incredible ability to learn from consequences. If our actions had no consequences, learning would be impossible. When a child touches a hot stove, they learn not to do it again. When we make mistakes in relationships, we often become better partners. When societies create laws, they aren't assuming people have unlimited freedom. They're creating environments that encourage better decisions and discourage harmful ones. In many ways, civilization itself is built upon understanding human behavior. Think about education. Why do we educate children? Because we believe knowledge changes future choices. Why do athletes train? Because practice changes future performance. Why do therapists exist? Because conversations can change thought patterns. Why do parents teach values? Because experiences shape character. Every one of these activities assumes something profoundly important. Human beings can change. Maybe not instantly. Maybe not perfectly. But gradually. And if change is possible, then hope is possible. Perhaps we've been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of asking, do we have complete free will or no free will at all? Maybe we should ask, how much freedom can we develop? Perhaps freedom isn't a switch that's either on or off. Perhaps it's a skill. The more aware we become of our habits, our biases, our emotions, and our unconscious influences, the more room we create between impulse and action. That tiny space is incredibly powerful. In that space, we pause before speaking in anger. We question our assumptions instead of accepting them automatically. We resist habits that no longer serve us. We choose kindness when revenge feels easier. We keep learning even when our instincts tell us to stay comfortable. Maybe that is what real freedom looks like. Not freedom from biology, not freedom from experience, not freedom from every influence, but the freedom to understand those influences and slowly rise above some of them. The famous psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who survived unimaginable suffering, once wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our power to choose our response. Whether or not that space begins a fraction of a second after unconscious brain activity is almost beside the point. What matters is that human beings can reflect, learn, adapt, and become different from who they were yesterday. So where does all of this leave us? Science has challenged one of humanity's oldest beliefs. It has shown us that our minds are far more mysterious than we once imagined. Our brains begin processes before we notice them. Our choices are shaped by countless hidden influences. We are not as independent as our intuition suggests. But science has also revealed something equally remarkable. The same brain that carries our habits is capable of changing them. The same mind that is influenced by experience can create new experiences. The same person who made poor decisions yesterday can make wiser ones tomorrow. And perhaps that is the most inspiring conclusion of all. Maybe freedom was never about acting without causes. Maybe freedom is the lifelong process of understanding ourselves so deeply that we become capable of making better choices than our past would have predicted. Because in the end, the greatest discovery isn't whether free will exists exactly as we imagined. The greatest discovery is that understanding how our minds work gives us the power to become better versions of ourselves. And perhaps, that is the most meaningful kind of freedom anyone could ever hope to have. Thank you, Dutz X.